morning. How's everybody tonight? Oh, we can get applause. Yay! We're done. Love that. We're done. Have a good evening. So, I'm Carol Honig. I'm, some of you might know, both Peggy and myself, we used to own the bookstore here in Rockville Centre, Turn of the Corkscrew Books and Wine. Thank you. I said used to. But first I'd like to thank the staff here for helping us put this together. They put the food together and they took the names and registered. And so we're really grateful to the Rockville Centre Library. I was like, where am I? Okay. So again, I'm Carol Honig. I'm the author of the recently published Before She Was a Finley. Thank you. And the writer and content coordinator for Rockville Centre Living magazine. And if you get it in the June issue, you're going to see an article I wrote about Spitfires and Becky. I wished it had been an earlier issue for this event, but we didn't book it in time, so what can you do? I'm also the co-owner with Peggy of On the Road Book Events, and we're here selling these books, and publishers love it when we do these events, and it helps with the sales, so keep that in mind so we can bring more events to you. And we also have a podcast called Wildflowers Podcast, Books, Booze, and Banter. And we're filming this tonight, and it's going to be on the YouTube channel. So, but guess what? It's not about me tonight. It's about Becky Aikman. And she is the author of 2 books of narrative nonfiction, her memoir, Saturday Night Widows, and Off the Cliff, How the Making of Thelma and Louise Drove Hollywood to the Edge. She's a former journalist at Newsday and has written for the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, and other publications. But now she's here tonight to discuss with us her newest book, Spitfires, the American Women Who Flew in the Face of Danger During World War II, which has been getting well-deserved rave reviews. So please do me a favor and welcome Becky Aikman. Did they do your mic?
Yes, it's working.
Oh, okay. All right.
It is working, right?
Oh, okay, good. So first of all, I love the story. What inspired you to even write this book? And I wonder if you could share that with the audience.
I was talking with my mother, who was nearing 90 at that point, and telling her that I wanted to write a book about people who did something extraordinary, but the public hasn't really heard of them. And she immediately, without a pause, said, write about the American women who flew in England during the war. For her, World War II was the war. And I said, really? Are you sure? I never heard of this. And I actually started to do some research and I couldn't find anything about it. If it had happened, it was like it wasn't in any history source. So I asked her again, are you sure you weren't mistaken? And she said, no, I remember distinctly. I thought they were so noble and glamorous. I wanted to do what they did. And she had remembered that all her life because she had been a young child when she saw it, she thinks maybe on a newsreel. So I said, well, I'll try harder, it's my mother. And I looked further and eventually found out that there was an organization in Great Britain that would accept women pilots. It was called the Air Transport Auxiliary. And they would accept people from other countries and they would accept people with, missing an arm from the war or something like that, and they would accept even women. So these American women, I gradually found out their names and started tracking down information about them.
So I found that so interesting. So now you're on this track to find these stories. Was it difficult to find a publisher for this book?
No.
Good, that's good.
Because it's a very good story.
Exactly.
What can I say? Thank you, Mother.
Yeah.
I mean, it immediately was clear to me. The first thing I did was get in touch with a little museum in the town of Maidenhead, England, where they had a little display about the Air Transport Auxiliary, and I spoke on the phone to the head of the museum, who was an elderly gentleman, and the first thing he said, he was sort of tisk-tisking, he said, I hope you don't plan to fictionalize this,
Oh.
because nothing could be as exciting and glamorous as the reality. So I thought, okay, that sounds good too. So yeah, I did then find out names of some of the women and start searching for them. Usually when you do a book of history, there are all sorts of official sources you can look up, and there are archives in various institutions that have information. But in this case, everything was practically non-existent, because for some reason, these women were just forgotten when the war ended. So the very first place I went was the San Diego Air and Space Museum, because I had the name of one of the women. Her name was Mary Zerbel. And I saw by Googling that there were papers of hers at that museum. So I went there, and the librarian said, "You're the first person who's ever asked to see this." It was this dusty file. I opened it up. She came alive to me. She had been such a vibrant person. At the age of 19, she was the youngest woman flying instructor in the United States. She was frequently covered in the press, partly because she was very pretty and they liked to pose her on the airplanes. But she was very well known. And during the war, she also made international headlines for her exploits. And after the war, also did some crazy stuff, to the extent that after the war, a movie was made based on her life starring Lana Turner. So I thought, how could no one know about this? She sounds fantastic. And then I got to the last page of the file, and it was her obituary. It was 3 sentences long. It was in the Pocatello, Idaho newspaper, and it didn't even say she knew how to fly. So at this moment, I made a vow: these people deserve to be known, and I guess I've got to do it. So I started from there and tracked down the others eventually.
Well, I kept shaking my head when I was reading this, because I'm like, oh my gosh, the research, that I didn't even realize that it was even that, intense, that you had to get through. And then you did have access to the diaries too of
Yes.
some, and how was that? How did you get that?
Well, a few of the women had a sense of their importance, and they donated their diaries and letters to some institutions. The Hoover Institution at Stanford had the diaries of one of the pilots, very extensive. But these people weren't famous enough. None of them had been digitized or transcribed, so it was just the pages with the scratchy handwriting. And then COVID happened and really slowed me down because the libraries were closed, but that's another story. So I found a few that way, and Mary Zerbel's were in that museum, but they helped me find her daughter, who could tell me a lot more, because she didn't really have a lot in the way of diaries, so I needed more information. But then I said, I've got to track down the families. These will be the people who've heard the stories. And, like one person I was looking for was named Ann Smith. I just randomly called Ann Smiths all over America, and it was very embarrassing, but eventually I did hit the one. She said, "Oh right, that was my aunt, Hazel." So these people were so excited to hear from me, which as a journalist, like, a lot of people don't want to hear from you, but these people were thrilled. They would all say, "I always thought my mother or my aunt should be famous, so this has got to happen." And they went into their attics and dug up amazing diaries, photographs, journals, letters, and were very open, sharing them all with me. So I got to really know these characters in a very intimate way.
That is just, the resilience is amazing. So, did you want to give us a bit of background in some of these women? I have 3 different women. I don't know why I picked these names out, but I have Dorothy Fury, Jacqueline Cochran. Did I say the last name correct?
Yes, you did.
Okay. And Winnabelle Pierce.
Okay.
I don't know if you want.
I don't play favorites, you know.
Oh, okay. That was going to be one of my questions. Okay.
I love them all, even though many of them were deeply flawed people, as you could see in some ways, but I empathized with all of them. They had their reasons. Dorothy Fury is a good example. These women came from every aspect of American society. And I will mention Virginia Farr first, because she's so opposite. Virginia Farr was a member of the family of the Western Union fortune, which was the tech giant of its time. They were very wealthy with private railroad cars and the whole works. She was raised to be a debutante who would attract a wealthy husband, like her cousins who married Roosevelts and Auchinclosses and everything. She had no interest in this whatsoever. So when she learned that Americans could fly in England, for her, it was an escape from this gilded cage. And she was able to go there and work as an everyday pilot and not be treated in that fancy way. So I brought her up because she's so opposite Dorothy Fury. Many of them, once they got over there, could invent themselves as they pleased. And Virginia Farr did that, inventing herself as not the fancy debutante. And they kept kind of a secret of what they were back home. Dorothy Fury came from an impoverished family. She had an 8th grade education. She was actually very intelligent and self-educated. She read important books and everything, but she left school and started working. So she was from this very underprivileged background, but she was very beautiful. And she was also very imperious. Like, she carried herself like, I am the boss here. So when she got to England, people there assumed that any woman from America who had learned to fly was probably very well off, and so they decided she was an American heiress. She had one red dress that she recycled for every occasion, and she carried herself in this imperious way, so they thought she was aristocratic. And she worked this to her advantage. It's quite the story, but members of the aristocracy were extremely attracted to her, and she worked her way up the social ladder. And even years after the war, people in England would refer to her as the Countess, who was the American heiress. It worked. So that was one. You had
Jacqueline Cochran.
No, Jacqueline Cochran. Well, Jacqueline Cochran was also from a very poor background. She started working in a factory at the age of 8. And she was illiterate, which no one knew at the time. We found that out recently. But she was very driven. She worked as a hair colorist in a beauty salon. She worked her way up and got invited to the parties of the fancy people who got their hair done with her. She eventually started her own cosmetics company and became a self-made millionaire. And she used that money to buy airplanes and become America's most famous aviatrix. She won air races, she set endurance and altitude records. She was really famous at the time and won the same kind of awards that Charles Lindbergh and Amelia Earhart won. She is the person who put together this group to go to England because she was very ambitious and wanted American women to fly in the US. The American military would not permit women to fly. So she thought she would take a group of Americans to Great Britain, prove that they could fly, and then come back and be put in charge of flying women back home. So that was her ambition. And she made quite the impression in England. She was very flashy, and people there found her vulgar. But Jackie Cochran generally got what she wanted.
Yeah, that's I picked up on that. So we have Winnabelle Pierce.
Winnabelle Pierce, okay. Well, she was from sort of a middle-class background, and she went to Wellesley College. Winnabelle was really wild, what can I say? She was a party girl to the max. She flew out of Roosevelt Field here on Long Island, which was also a big party scene. Several of my ladies came from that group, and when they got to England, they carried on the tradition. She had lots of love affairs, and she also flew in a very wild way. She loved the thrill. She would do things that were dangerous. That was frowned upon in the Air Transport Auxiliary, and her arch rival was actually Virginia Farr, who was very careful and sober-sided about it, and they were sort of the two leaders in who got promoted the fastest to the planes, because Winnie did have a very natural talent as an aviator. And I'll tell this one story about her. The British really looked down on her and rolled their eyes at her crazy ways. But one day she took off in a Hurricane fighter, and the engine failed right after takeoff, which aviators know is the worst thing that can happen. You're not high enough in the sky to circle around and figure out a good place to glide down. You're not going fast enough to maintain any airspeed and be able to turn. The instructions from the higher ups were that if this happened to you, you were supposed to just go straight ahead and crash. It was your best chance of survival. But 2 weeks before, Winnie had served as the pallbearer at the funeral of one of her classmates, and she just decided like that, I'm not doing this, and she decided to do what pilots call the impossible turn. And it's impossible because at that speed, that height, to turn around and go back and land at the airport is considered crazy. But somehow, long story short, Winnie pulled it off, established herself as a person with tremendous natural talent. Like today a computer would tell you how to do it, but she figured it out. So she was one of the really fun characters in the book. And I think because I told that story, maybe I should stop for a moment to explain what they were doing there and why it was extremely dangerous. It was one of the most dangerous jobs of the war. The air transport auxiliary pilots were an auxiliary of the Royal Air Force. They would pick up aircraft at factories and deliver them to air bases. And they were churning out aircraft so quickly that they were often untested and often failed. Then at the other end, they would pick up the aircraft that had been damaged in battles and fly them back, little knowing what was wrong with that aircraft. They also had horrendous British weather, and they flew without instruments. So they were frequently caught in a cloud, they'd lose visibility, they'd smack into a mountain or something and be killed. 1 in 4 pilots who did this job were killed in crashes. So the American women were thrilled to be there. They found it exhilarating and freeing. It was their ultimate desire to do this, but at the same time, it was extremely dangerous, and not everybody made it back in one piece.
It's amazing, absolutely amazing. You did write on this part, just stood out to me, when you wrote about the reaction of some of the workers at the aerodrome, mostly men, and when they lined up to gawk at these American women when they arrived. Do you remember that story from
Yes.
the book?
The first group of Americans arrived in March of 1942. It was really before American troops had come in any numbers. There were just a few liaison people planning for American troops to come because the United States had just entered the war and wasn't really geared up for it. So these were kind of the first diplomats from the United States who served in the war. And there was a romanticized vision of what American would be like, what American women would be like. They'd be very glamorous and blonde and, like Jean Harlow or something. So one of these women described how everyone lined up to watch them come into the aerodrome, the men, and how disappointed they looked because the women had been at sea for 3 weeks, they were tired, there had not been hot water or even fresh water on the boat. You don't call it a boat, it's a ship, it was a cargo ship. So they were feeling pretty rough and felt that they made a horrible first impression. Then they went out that night and all got plastered, which made another terrible impression. And their ID photographs were taken the next morning, and they were constantly reminded of what a mistake they had made.
Well, I also noticed that later on in the war, it seemed as though gender wasn't quite as important any longer. Is that fair to say?
That's very fair to say. I think for a lot of people, this was sort of a feminist utopia. The British needed this help desperately. They were grateful for it. Anybody who would come from another country and do this dangerous work to help save them, they really respected them. And so the women were treated very well. They were paid very well. They were given the same work that the men were given. When the ATA, it's the Air Transport Auxiliary, began, women were not allowed to fly higher grades of aircraft. But by the time the Americans got there, they could fly anything, and they did. They would fly little single-engine planes. They would fly the very fast fighters, the Spitfires and the Hurricanes, and they would fly the large bombers. So at about that time, the ATA went to Parliament and said they're doing the exact same job as the men, and Parliament passed the first equal pay law in Great Britain for these pilots. It was decades before there was another one, but they really proved themselves, and as a result, they were treated well. People knew they were doing tough, hard work. The pilots were required to fly up to 147 different models of aircraft. Often aircraft they'd never seen before. They were given a one-page card on each one that would explain the parameters of speed and how the takeoff worked. They would read it and they would go. They had to be very talented and very brave to do this. I certainly would not.
No, it was that every page that I was turning, I was just like, who are these people? Like, they're just so interesting, and
It makes you wonder, like, you hear a lot about that in World War II. People who exhibited tremendous bravery, and they were sort of ordinary women, but they stepped up.
Yeah.
And I think it's hard for us today to imagine this.
Yeah.
People that brave and that self-sacrificing.
Right. I guess they knew what they were fighting for.
They did. They felt they were right.
Right, right.
But also, they weren't all idealists completely. They were personally ambitious. They loved to fly. They wanted to continue to fly after the war. They knew nobody would want to hire women, so they wanted to prove themselves. And I really think by the end, they had to be the best pilots in the world.
Yeah.
Flying any aircraft, most people in the Air Force would be trained to fly one or two things and do it over and over. Also, total respect for that. But you had to have real talent, and who wouldn't want to hire them?
Yeah.
Turns out everybody.
Yeah, one quote from Nancy Miller, it says, "It might have started out as a lark for many." She was young and shy, apparently. Okay.
Yes, she was.
But the work soon told. And then you go on to write how their personalities ranged from fun-loving to sober-minded, reckless to cautious, but they all shared a steadiness of purpose and iron self-assurance. And they did. They were all amazing.
At the beginning, they wondered who would come out on top, who would get promoted, who would have the best reputation as the best pilot out there. And they thought it might be the people with the most experience, or it might be the people with the least experience, therefore they didn't know enough to be afraid. It turned out it was some of each, but those who made it through to the end and really excelled were the ones who had absolutely steady nerves. Nothing rattled them, something horrible went wrong, as it always did, and they just thought through their options, they made their decision, they did it. And that Nancy Miller is actually today the last living air transport auxiliary pilot of any gender or nationality. She's turning 106 in a couple weeks. When I saw her most recently, I said this question we're talking about, weren't you ever afraid? Because I know some of her exploits were out there. And she said, no, I had a job to do. And that's sort of how she was. She would describe these situations where her life was really on the line. She never seemed to say, oh my God, I was so upset, and then I tried this. It was just, she did it.
Wow. I also found the story of gender pioneer Joy Ferguson interesting.
Oh,
do you want to go into that?
She was not one of the Americans. She was one of the British pilots, and she was Joy Ferguson, and she became one of the first transgender people after the war, and became, I forget, John Ferguson, Jay Ferguson?
Jonathan, she became Jonathan.
Jonathan Ferguson, and got an immediate huge pay raise because as a man, he was now paid more. So that's a strategy.
That made me crazy when I read that. I was like, are you kidding me? Oh, okay. Just a couple more questions, because we have such a big audience, they probably have a ton of questions for you. Could you talk about the difference between the WASPs and the Air Transport Auxiliary Flyers?
Right. That was one of the things that confused me when my mother first told me about it. I said, you sure you don't mean the WASP? Now, Jackie Cochran, who we've heard about, wanted to form a women's flying corps for the United States. And her main purpose in taking the Americans over there was to prove women could do it and then come back and run the WASP, which is what she succeeded in doing. And so it did start and was based on the success of these women in England who were then forgotten, and everyone thinks the WASP were the first women to fly military aircraft. So they started about 9 months later and had a very different experience. Unlike Britain, where the pilots were treated with great respect, the American public was always very skeptical that women should be in cockpits. There was a lot of publicity about it, and so much so that in 1944, while the war was still raging, the WASPs were disbanded. Because everyone said, well, they'll take jobs from men when the war is over. So the women who signed up for that didn't even get to finish out the war. A few of the ATA women did go back to join the WASP, and then they were sorry because they were out of a job.
They were also sabotaged.
There's a very good book about the WASP called Women with Silver Wings, and it gives examples of sugar and rags put in gas tanks and things like that to sabotage the women.
Real nice.
Yeah.
So I understand that you were given a flying lesson.
Oh, well, yes. Well, one of the first people I met was the niece of one of the pilots who became a pilot herself, inspired by that, and she has 2 daughters who are now pilots as well. So there is a real legacy there. And I went to visit her in Las Vegas where she taught flying, and she took me up in her plane. And I mean, I'm an okay flyer, but now that I knew all these stories of the crashes and the things that are going wrong, I'm up there in this little plane with her, and I just became so conscious that there was this little piece of metal and my feet were on it, and below that there was nothing. Like thousands of feet. I don't know how high we were. And she asked me to take the controls so she could show me stuff, which I did briefly, and I said, I'm sorry, I just can't do this. So I started off as a brave flyer, and now I'm a very timid flyer. I would not have had steady nerves.
I'm with you. So Spitfires was such an impressive undertaking, and I really want to thank you for telling us about this important piece of history, but I also want to open it up to questions. Is anyone here? I mean, I had parts of the book that I wanted you to read from, but I don't know if we would rather just hear your questions. I see a hand raising.
Okay.
I'm just wondering how long it took you to do the work from concept to completion.
Mm-hmm.
How long did it take?
I got the contract to do the book in January of 2020. I worked on it for a few months to make sure I could do it before I went to publishers. And then, of course, COVID hit almost immediately, and I couldn't travel. So that was frustrating. But I did as much as I could from the United States, and there was so much to do that worked out fine. So basically, 5 years from then to publication, yeah. It was a lot of work, but I loved every day of it. And when I wrote the last page, I just thought, I'm going to miss them so much. They were such a part of my life, and I knew them so intimately because diaries, you know everything, and it was hard to let go.
Anyone else?
Yeah.
Oh.
Is there any mention of these women or women like them in the Smithsonian, in the Air and Space Museum that's there, or do you know, or?
Not that I know of. Their archive had a photograph of one of the women, Anne Wood, who was one of the most prominent after the war. And so we obtained a photograph from them of her, but I don't think there's anything else. In England, there's much more about this. And there have been books about the English women. Some of them wrote their own books, and there have been documentaries about them. It's just much better known there. I really think these Americans got lost in the cracks of history after the war. People doing research on the war would look into people in the American military. They wouldn't think to look for people who were serving abroad for someone else. Yes, there's someone over here.
Yeah. Along the same line, you mentioned that some of them flew out of Roosevelt Field. Are any of them mentioned in the Cradle of Aviation Museum, right here?
I never checked. I don't know. I really doubt it.
The answer is no.
Oh,
I work there, so
Oh,
sadly, no.
get on it.
That's your assignment.
I'm not the curator, I'm sorry.
Well, I'm sure they didn't know about it. Nobody knew about it. No one should be embarrassed not to have known about it.
In a similar vein, are you familiar with the American Echo Museum?
I know about it. I haven't been there.
Because they have a wasp exhibit, and I think this is something they would also be very interested in,
Mm-hmm.
especially this weekend, which is always their biggest weekend of the year. And there is a lot of history in the museum, even though it's kind of small, but I think this is something they would be very interested in.
Someone suggested I should speak there, but no one has asked me. They probably haven't heard of it. Anyone else?
And this, I almost am afraid to ask you, because I have a memory, as I was reading it, I have a memory of a relative, an older relative, whenever I did something as a young child that was like, great, or atta girl, as I was reading this, I was like, oh my goodness, is that, like, was there a saying that came out of this?
Atta girl, yeah.
Like, I remember, and I can't picture who it is, but through the whole book, I kept thinking, like, it just really resonated with me.
That you've heard the expression "atta girl."
I've heard the expression "atta girl," and I've never heard of this program, and it reminds me of like when I was like, oh, I was doing something that, so I just wonder if maybe.
Well, one of the nicknames for the women was "atta girls," but I do think it was because it was an expression, you know, "atta girl" or "atta boy" or something like that. I think so. They like to call themselves that. They had various nicknames. The men called themselves the Ancient and Tattered Airmen, and the women called themselves the Always Terrified Airwomen, but they did prefer "atta girls," so it's a little more flattering. Yeah. I don't.
Is somebody here?
Was the title difficult to choose?
Oh, sorry, what?
The title, was it difficult to choose?
I always liked the title Spitfires because the Spitfire was the iconic fighter plane of the war. It was the one they all enjoyed flying the most, and it was also a term for a brave and feisty woman. And in fact, the name of the aircraft was named for that. The head of the manufacturing company for Spitfires had a daughter who he called Spitfire because there had been a Katharine Hepburn movie where she was a feisty woman, and so then they called the aircraft Spitfire, and now I'm calling the women in the aircraft the Spitfires. So we're taking a whole circle.
Yeah, but eventually it had to be a car, I think, it was in the 60s.
There was a car eventually, but they were just copying it. But the women loved the Spitfire. It and the Hurricane Fighter were credited with saving Britain during the Battle of Britain when the Germans were bombing them every night and killing lots of civilians. And these individual fighter pilots would go up in these little planes and fight off the Germans. People were so grateful to them. And the Hurricane also had a very good record in battle, but the Spitfire had a romance about it. It was a beautiful design. I say in the book it was one of the great triumphs of British design, like the Aston Martin sports car and the miniskirt. It's really quite lovely. The women flyers loved it because the cockpit was narrow and really fit a woman's body, and it was very responsive and very fast. One of the women said, I felt like I'd had a kick in the pants and I was at 1,000 feet. And other women said that you didn't have to do more than think about where you wanted it to go and it would go. And they loved to do aerobatics in it, twirling and everything, which they weren't supposed to do, but they did. And another woman said, and then I'll stop about the Spitfire, you didn't fly the Spitfire, you wore it, because it was so chic. So I felt like I should call the book Spitfires. It describes them and it described the thing that they loved, flying that aircraft. And there were a couple others. Yes, there.
Do we know what?
Oh, there are two people, one behind the other.
Do we know what percentage of the women became successful commercial pilots?
Yes, I do. Do people want spoilers or no? One of the main threads throughout the book is how they're fighting to have the kind of record where they can be hired after the war and do what they loved. I'll tell you a little without getting too specific. no American passenger airline would hire a woman pilot after the war. The first one was in 1973. The American military would not hire women pilots after the war. So these women had to be extremely resourceful. None of the normal avenues for employment were open to them. A few of them were very resourceful and came up with ways to fly. One of them became the first woman vice president of a major airline, Pan Am. One of them, with her husband, started a private company that delivered aircraft around the world, sort of like the ATA. Like if Brazil wanted to buy an aircraft that was in Thailand, they'd transport it for them. It was a very, also dangerous job. I think it was the one in Thailand, they tried to take off and it wasn't working, and they realized that the spark plugs were missing and someone had stuffed cigarette butts in it instead. Well, luckily they figured it out in time. And one of them came home and took a job at a flying school in Oregon. She was from Los Angeles, that was the closest she could get. And her job was like cleaning the bathrooms and everything. But she used her free time to learn how to fly a helicopter. She became only the second woman in the United States certified as a commercial helicopter pilot. And she and her husband went to Alaska and founded the first helicopter charter company in Alaska, eventually owning a huge fleet of helicopters and very successful. And she's widely admired by women who fly helicopters around the world. She was the fourth in the world and the second in the United States.
What was her name?
Well, do we want spoilers or no? I'll tell you this one. It's Nancy Miller, the one who's still alive. Yeah. And then some had more trouble, but they all had pretty distinctive lives because they were not people who were going to come home and be quiet. You had a question, Melissa.
You mentioned you were very attached to the women you researched, and you've devoted 5 years of your life or more to this project. And I'm just wondering what your process is as a writer to choose your next project. And it may be too early for you to answer this question, but I'm just curious, how do you let go of one project and then decide on what to write next?
Yeah, the question is, how do I go on to the next book when I'm so attached to these characters? It's going to be very hard. When you write nonfiction, so much of your battle is in choosing your topic. We don't get to make anything up. We don't get to improve the plot. Everything has to be real. Everything people say they had to have really said. So you can't pick a story that's sort of half there and then just trickles out with no resolution. You want a story that will read like a novel and has beginning, middle, and end, has great varied characters. So this book was a dream come true for a nonfiction writer because it had all of that. So I'm going to do research until I find something that can also play without having to be fictionalized, as that person warned me at the beginning of this. As I was doing it, each character, as I get to know her, I'm thinking, if you put this in fiction, people would think you were making them up. They were such, we didn't go through a lot of them. They all had very distinctive personalities and were fun to describe. So I'll have to hold out until something really good.
Maybe you
turns
could
out.
work on the documentary for this book. Wouldn't that be something? Is that a possibility?
My most frequently asked question, and I can't believe it's taken this long, is when are they making the movie?
Right.
And that is asked very frequently, and we shall see what happens.
Okay.
My first book is being adapted for a television series, and the people working on it say it will be tough because it would be very expensive to make this one. You have to have all those vintage aircraft and period everything.
Would you ever hire John Williams?
They'd have to do that too. Okay, don't groan, but they say Hollywood doesn't like to spend that kind of money on women's movies.
I'm going to groan.
This is the quote from the screenwriter saying, They like women's stories to be the women sit around drinking wine and talking about their boyfriends.
Oh, boy.
So that is not the story. So we'll see. I mean, it's out there. There are people who are interested. They would have to have a lot of money. And that's just to pay me. No. They'd have to have a lot of money to recreate these aircraft. I don't know if anyone saw Masters of the Air. It was, I know what that cost, and I'm not supposed to tell people, but it was an unbelievable expense to recreate those flying scenes. They were very well done. Yes.
I just want to mention, Eric Larson, every single one of his books have been optioned by Hollywood, and yet none of them have, as of yet, gotten to the screen. I mean, the last one I heard so many things about, Tom Hanks wanted in the Garden of Beasts, he wanted to be the diplomat, and none of them have been made. So don't, it's just, because the first thing I thought was this should be made into a Hollywood, type of a movie. But it's
But yeah, you're right, and I'm sure his aren't made because they're very expensive to make.
And he also, when he picks, his subjects, also like what you say, you have to make sure that there's enough, stuff to really lean on to write these books, otherwise you don't have a book. And speaking about that, your editor, how did you put this book together? I'm sure you must have left characters on the
I'm kind of missing the end here, I'm not hearing you.
Everything you wanted into the book without an editor, saying, cut 50 pages here, 20 pages there. I mean, how much control did you have over writing the book?
Okay. It's pretty much what I wrote.
Right.
Yeah, I always felt I had total control of this story. I knew where it was going. And the hardest thing in creating the book was to make it chronological, which I was determined to do. I didn't want it to just be a bunch of anecdotes, and then this thing happened, and the year before that, that had happened. I wanted to go along with the story of the war, how they fit into what was happening in the war, how their work contributed, and I wanted it to follow that arc, and then get to the end of the war where we see, did they get the dream they wanted after the war? That was the hardest thing because a lot of the raw material wasn't dated. Like people wrote a journal after the war, but they just told random stories. So I had these crazy charts that I made where I would take all the different sources and figure out where each character was each month and what they were doing so that I could then weave it into the story. I just felt that was essential. And it took me a long time to put that chart together. But some of them would write about each other in their diaries. Like someone who didn't have a diary, other people might be gossiping about that person in their diary, and that might be dated. So then I'd know, okay, that happened in March of '43. So eventually I got the timeline together, and from that point on, the writing was pretty clear for me. Shall I call on people? You want to call on people?
Either
You're
one.
the boss.
Oh, no. Oh, say that louder. Back there.
I wanted to ask you, how many of the women were you able to interview? How many were still alive that you were able to contact?
The only one who was still alive when I started was Nancy Miller. All the rest were gone because, it's a long time ago. But their families often had heard the stories. Some not, some didn't talk about it much. Others knew great stories.
Oh, yes. What do you hope readers take away about, women's roles in history, especially in wartime, after reading Spitfires?
Yeah, in case you're in the back, what do I hope people will take away from this?
Take away from
about women and wartime? Well, I think it's very important that this kind of history be told. The fact that nobody knew about them is sad because for anyone trying to do something difficult in this world where the world doesn't expect you would be good at it, if you've heard about people in history who've done it, it has to be very encouraging. So if you want to be a pilot and you're a young woman, to know that these women did this incredible work so long ago with very little support from anybody, I think would help her to say, yes, I can do this too. And it's not just for people who want to fly an airplane, it's for anything. To say these women were tough, resilient, smart, capable, it shows that they can be. So I think it's a message that unfortunately we still need to make sure comes across. Back there?
In that process of integrating all the stories and creating the timeline, were there any stories you had to leave out or that were left out?
Oh yeah. I mean,
Anything real good?
it's a big complex book, and that was hard to keep it straight, and I couldn't have too many characters, and I needed each character to be very well defined, so when they turned up, people would say, oh right, she's the one who, whatever. So I did leave out a couple characters who were interesting, but in some ways they were similar. Virginia Farr was known as the flying socialite. Another flyer named Suzanne Ford was also known as the flying socialite from where she was from. So she became a very minor person who just shows up here and there in this book, because otherwise you've got two flying socialites, your brain would explode. So I had to leave out things like that, unfortunately. And that was also a great story because I tried so hard to get stuff about Suzanne Ford, the other flying socialite, that I actually contacted people who bought the house she had once lived in to ask if anything had been left behind, and it had. Wow. They had a box of her stuff that they shared with me, and so I thought, wow, what a great discovery story, but I just felt that Virginia Farr's story was so much richer that I had to leave out this one. So there was a lot of that sort of thing, and there were also great hair-raising stories about other pilots, not the American women, and you think, wow, that story is so great, I'd love to put it in, but I couldn't let it divert off into too many different directions. So yeah, there was a lot to leave out.
Have any of the, I'm sorry. Have any of the family members gone to any of your events yet?
Yes. Yeah, it's only been a couple weeks. But yes, the granddaughter of Winnie Pierce came to my first event in New York 2 weeks ago. And a couple nights ago, the other granddaughter of Winnie Pierce came to an event in Maryland. Oh, nice. And it's just great to talk to the families. They're all really, really excited. I mean, they've all written to me. They each got an early copy. And they're just so thrilled. They've been waiting for this moment, that they knew they had this relative who deserved recognition, and now she's getting it. So it's very gratifying. Nobody's mad at me for the Winnie Pierce granddaughters. I was a little worried because, you know, her behavior wasn't always on the straight and narrow. And also Dorothy Fury's son, I was concerned, but he loves it, so they knew their mothers better than anybody.
Right, exactly. We have time for one more question before Becky will autograph copies. And, you know, it's Memorial Day weekend, but not only that, Father's Day is coming up. And I think it'll make a great Father's Day gift, an autographed copy.
I'm getting more letters from men than women.
Really?
Maybe men write letters more readily to authors?
Maybe.
Because that's a little surprising, but yeah, they're into it.
So anybody, one more question? No?
Yeah. So recently, I know the American women flyers were recognized in the United States. Was there any plans, like it seems that in Britain they were more honored during the war? Is there anything that the Brits are planning to do for the American flyers, like a memorial or anything over there, or a statue?
The British have done various things to recognize their flyers, and some of them have got medals and things. One American woman got the King George Medal a couple years after the war because she had really been stalwart, and also she was just buddies with a lot of the British flyers, so I think they just knew about her. She's the only one who I think got any recognition among the Americans, but various British ones did. And when they have died, their obituaries have been very glowing. and all over the place. So they're known over there.
So do me a favor, give a round of applause. Thank you again, Becky, appreciate it.